Hello, this is Dr. Dan Kahinka. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss contemporary challenges and solutions in the workplace and how these challenges are addressed by industrial organizational psychologists. After a fairly thorough review of challenges on a more global scale, I found some various themes that popped up when I was researching different countries and what some of the challenges that they're experiencing in human resources. And now, granted, many countries are different depending on economic conditions and all those things, but there were a few different themes that popped up that I'm going to address today. I'll kind of quickly go through these themes right now, and then we'll go take our time and go through each one individually. We'll talk about globalization and diversity and how industrial organizational psychologists define diversity and how they address that, and what globalization means to us in the field of psychology and how we can help organizations improve performance and turnover and some of those things, which I'll be addressing. We look at generational and cultural differences and how that can actually be problematic by grouping people together and not focusing on people as individuals and looking at their knowledge, skills, abilities, and those things that are important to performance. We'll look at bureaucracy, administration, overregulation, and law. So what you have there is both internal increased regulation as well as external by government forces, and how those challenges to some degree can stifle an organization's growth and performance. Yet if with properly trained industrial organizational psychologists who can help build a culture, perhaps a leadership culture of innovation that to some degree, at least to some of these challenges associated with law and bureaucracy, can be overcome. We'll look at corruption, ethics, morality, essentially religion and spirituality in many different countries has largely been sort of removed from the workplace, whereas it once used to be an intricate part of the workplace, and how these, by doing so, it's correlated with behaviors that we don't want in the workplace, whether it be bullying type behaviors, whether it be challenges associated with lower levels of spirituality and religion, like stress. Some of these things, so I'll chat about that as well, and provide you with some ideas on how we can address these issues, as well as, once again, in a global environment where many people, statistically over half the world is religious or belongs to one of the largest organized religions. So it's become to a point where leaders in the workplace need to embrace this and not push it aside. And there's many good reasons for doing that, which I'll describe. We live in an environment where there's limited resources. I'll address that. A concept that I call unhealthy technology, which is simply overuse of technology and how that can be problematic when it comes to the people. We'll look at turnover and talent retention, how you can address those challenges from a perspective of an industrial organizational psychologist. We'll look at compensation and rewards in a way that maybe you never have before. So I'll really hopefully provide you with some great alternatives that can help organizations not just save money, but improve performance, have a more engaged workforce. We'll talk about rapid change and innovation. We live in an environment where change is happening hourly, daily. It's happening very rapidly, and organizations need to be prepared for that so they can innovate, keep up with the times, and maintain their segment of the marketplace. And then finally, leadership development. I end with that because it is so critical for organizations to develop leaders within. All right, so let's begin by talking about globalization and diversity. Now, I will give you, throughout the next few slides here, my perspective as an industrial organizational psychologist. I'm not suggesting that all IO psychologists take on this perspective, but it is a scientific perspective when we talk about diversity. What I mean by that is many times when people think about diversity, they think in terms of gender, skin color, culture, of origin. However, as a scientist, I think of industrial organizational psychology and, I think of diversity as characteristics, intrinsic characteristics, personality characteristics, leadership characteristics, knowledge, skills, abilities, those things. What's interesting from a universal standpoint is that people across the globe will have certain similar traits. So whether I use some sort of assessment in America, in China, in Australia, somewhere in Africa, in South America, in Europe, what will end up happening is I can identify using assessments, particularly traits like the Big Five. What the Big Five is, now keep in mind there are some authors that have found 4,000 different characteristics of people. Others have shortened it to 3. What's interesting for me is the Big Five, because it identifies these 5 characteristics that are universal traits. And within those, if you explore this further, you will find that these definitely will apply to you. And so what these can be used for is developing individuals within an organization, perhaps to be better leaders or just to better understand each other. We'll talk more about that once I talk about that overuse of technology, how people don't understand each other perhaps as much as they used to. So openness, conscientiousness. What these mean here is levels. So in other words, extroversion. What that means is people across the globe will have some level of extroversion, either high levels, meaning that they like to be the center of attention. They like to engage people, engage in small talk. Perhaps they have lots of friends and they find it easy to make friends. That's one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum would be low levels of extroversion, also known as being introverted, introversion. If someone's more introverted, even like myself, when I'm done giving a presentation or interacting a lot with people, I may feel drained, may feel tired. So these characteristics, and people fall anywhere in between that spectrum, they apply to people globally. And that's how an industrial organizational psychologist would, for instance, view diversity, is people are diverse. They have these varying characteristics, among other things. And while we are similar as human beings, where we all have to some degree these characteristics and traits, we are still all unique and have different levels of these characteristics, among other things. So the evidence-based methods, the reason why I mention that here is because we use assessments, psychological assessments, to help determine these various characteristics. And then in turn, these can be used for training, development, hiring, all of those things. And then manage bias. What does that mean here? Well, people will look at other people and immediately in their head, for good or bad reasons, it doesn't necessarily matter, but we will see people based on their exterior appearance. That's pretty standard. Well, internally we may have some bias because of a very common one would be attractiveness. We have a bias towards people that are more attractive than others. And if this applies in the workplace, let's say we are in the human resources department, we are selecting people for a job. And if we do not manage this bias, we may select the people that are not the most qualified because we are, whether we realize it or not, selecting people maybe because of their looks, because they're more attractive or not, or whatever it may be. Therefore, we want to use evidence-based approaches to measure things such as whether it be personality characteristics, measure specific levels of experience or education or ability, knowledge levels. All of these things, we want to measure that stuff when we are selecting people, so that way we manage bias, and particularly in a very diverse global environment where we may have all sorts of preconceived notions about different people from different countries, different skin colors, different gender, whatever it may be. We want to try as best we can to manage that bias when we are selecting individuals. Here again, selecting may be for a job, for a promotion, for different opportunities. Generational differences are perhaps to some people apparent, meaning Older generations, people might say they're more stable, more respectful, more willing in the workplace, let's say, to be dedicated, to committed towards that workplace, whereas maybe the youngest of generations might be more demanding. Other stereotypes might be they're not satisfied, want more, want things quicker, want, right? That is to some people will say that's some of the younger generation. Now, whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter, because if, just like I mentioned previously, if we begin to look at people and group them into something like a generation, then we may end up not selecting the best people for the job. One common example might be where someone might think that someone that's older does not understand technology as well as someone that's younger, because maybe they're older, they didn't grow up with technology. I would argue that many people like myself who are a little bit older, I've grown up with technology, so I've experienced it from the ground floor, and I think I understand it extremely well. Whereas maybe others can't, because they just have seen the technology that's currently available if they're much younger. So that's an argument that perhaps I am more knowledgeable about technology than maybe someone younger. But the whole point is, it's on an individual basis. We shouldn't be making judgment based on someone's generation. But many times, depending on the country you're in and the education system in that country, things like this may be emphasized more or less. Work ethic, commitment, impatience or patience, all of these attitudes can be, or excuse me, all of these characteristics can be applied to a certain generation, and we want to avoid that. We want to, again, focus using scientific methods, controlling bias, and looking at people for their knowledge, skills, abilities. Cultural differences, same thing. Unfortunately, when you're grouping people together, then you end up stereotyping, whether you do it intentionally or not, whether it's good or bad stereotypes or not. We want to avoid that. Cultures are very complex. For instance, in America, you have what some people may see as the American culture, and maybe people are similar. They may look at Americans and think that we are similar. However, the reality is, because we are a country that has, we are made up of immigrants, what you have is so many different cultures, but then you also have so many different subcultures. For this presentation, I put this picture on here intentionally because to some people, you may look at these people in this picture and see that they're all dressed the same. They maybe have the same skin complexion, a number of other attributes that they may, they're all, I believe here, female. So you may think that they're very similar. Well, the reality is these people in this picture may be extremely different. One person may be extremely religious. Another person might have a PhD education. Another person may have grown up in poverty and is barely getting by. Another person may have a very high IQ, so they're extremely intelligent, versus another person maybe not so much. Maybe they have a learning disability. So you can see, just because people may look the same, they are extremely different oftentimes. So we need evidence-based approaches. We need, whether it be psychological assessment, structured forms of interviews, things of that nature, to determine these facts, to measure them, and to compare that with the characteristics of the person we are looking for on the job. I made sure I made note here that not just that individuals are complex, which I already identified, but also that each person has strengths and needs. These are particularly important as we start talking about how people are motivated, how we train individuals, as we select people, what are their strengths, so particularly not just as we select them, but as we promote individuals. We want to perhaps try to match up as best we can people's strengths with the demands of the role that we're seeking to put them in. All right, let's transition into sort of the area of the presentation where I'm going to be addressing rules, regulations, that kind of stuff. So first we'll look what I consider more internal rules. Many organizations, perhaps impacted by external regulations and laws, many organizations are becoming highly bureaucratic. Administration significantly growing. You look at areas perhaps like in the healthcare system, to an extent, maybe education system. But let's use the healthcare system as an example because of many different laws associated with how people can be cared for, uh, insurance, all of that different stuff. From one country to another, that can greatly vary. I know for myself that what I've seen that just a mile across the border, you can go to Mexico where maybe the regulations are much different and less versus on the other side of the border in America, and as a result, you can get, for instance, prescription drugs very inexpensively in Mexico versus United States. These things we need to understand because we are now competing, as I mentioned previously, in a global marketplace. We need to understand these laws, regulations, and how they're impacting us internally and what we are doing, what we have control over internally in order to be competitive in the marketplace. Now, this sounds more like a business presentation than a psychology presentation. Well, let's talk about the psychology of that. If we have organizations, like many are so management oriented, in other words, we select people because of management skills. Maybe they're good. We ask questions like, are you good at time management? Are you good at being able to, develop, I'll say develop people, that might be an area of leadership, but are you good at being able to delegate tasks, things of that nature? That's management stuff. And if we are focusing so much on management, then what ends up happening is these managers become more administrators. They are following rules. They maybe make more rules, but it's all about the rules and following them and so forth, and tasks. However, if we develop leaders, if we become more of a leadership-driven organization, so we use like an assessment that I've created where you look at servant leadership characteristics, and you start identifying people that either are in a management position that are great leaders as well, or many people do not have a formal title but are great leaders. They lead within their teams and they get zero credit for it many times. We want to identify individuals like that because it's the leaders we need to turn to as we have a more highly bureaucratic system, because leaders can help break through some of that and identify the rules, regulations that are not needed, the critical rules, and then develop a culture where it's not just one or two people at the top of the hierarchy that are doing these tough tasks, but everyone within the organization are now identifying how to make the organization less bureaucratic, so it's better able to function, better able to, you'll see better innovation and some of those things that I'll talk more about shortly. I do also want to mention customer service, that in a more highly bureaucratic organization, customer service can greatly struggle. I wanted to use that example because in America, that is, in the healthcare system, that's something that's currently suffering. The healthcare system in America is extremely bureaucratic, and what ends up happening is the patient, who is the person receiving the healthcare, they're the customer, are many times shoved aside while the healthcare providers, the insurance providers, battle with costs and what is going to be done and the care that the patient gets, and the patient sits aside and hopes that they are going to get the best care. And so that's where the customer has really suffered, and we are in great need of some deregulation and getting rid of the many internal as well as external rules and regulations to better serve people, to have better customer service and better serve people's health. What I've just talked about is that internal regulation. Now we'll talk more about the external regulation, and that is many countries are continuously creating more laws, but failing to get rid of ones that are either out of date, not needed, or perhaps just need to be looked at again and determine if they are not needed. That many times does not happen, so the rule books get bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more rules, and as a result, that can really negatively impact an organization who has to now hire more and more people, many times more very expensive attorneys, very expensive high-level human resource people that understand all of these laws, and that can be very expensive and can really be damaging to a culture, because now they have to focus on so many rules and they cannot focus on on the development of people and the interactions. So how can psychologists address these challenges? Well, as I mentioned previously, and I'll mention many times again, we'll come back to leadership development. It is so critical to develop high-level leaders within an organization. And when I say high level, meaning high level in their abilities as leaders, not high level like a position, like a director or a chief financial officer or something like that, but in their abilities, developing people so they become leaders and they have the willingness, the capability, the permission, if you will, to be able to lead within the organization. They have that opportunity that they can do that. What will end up happening then is they can perhaps now better identify the laws and the regulations, the external ones that do or do not apply to their organization. Many times, if it's only one or two administrators that are doing this job, such as high-level human resource people, they may be misinterpreting some of the laws. And as a result, you have regulations within the workplace that could be, that perhaps are not needed. So if you develop a leadership culture, I promote a servant leadership culture, then what will end up happening is you can now start identifying some of these things and not be impacted as much negatively by overregulation and law. Transparency and trust are two characteristics of a servant leader, for example, that if you have people that understand servant leadership characteristics, you have a culture that embraces that, then people are much more transparent. They will explain, for instance, reasons for their actions. You'll have administrators that will say, all right, here's the reason why I'm doing this. Here's the reason for this new policy. And they're willing to talk about that versus just apply the new policy. They're willing to talk about the new regulation that's just come out and what they need to do internally. And then maybe people can help them develop a better process or a better system because there is this level of trust and transparency that goes back and forth between the administration and the people that are working hard on those front lines. Let's talk about corruption, ethics, and morality. To some degree, there's been an increase in corruption and unethical behavior and immoral behavior even within the workplace. It comes in many different forms, from theft to bullying type behaviors, harassment, to a very high level white collar, what might be referred to as like a white collar crime. In other words, embezzlement and some of these things. They're oftentimes, if not most times, done because of personal gain. Perhaps people are more concerned about making money and then the greater good than helping that organization, and so that for their personal gain, they perform unethical activities. It could even be simple as salespeople that are not quite explaining what the product is and misrepresenting the product. Internally, maybe they justify that because they think, well, the customer needs this, therefore, if I explain it this way, it's okay. So what they're doing is, that term is called cognitive dissonance. They're justifying within their mind that their behavior is okay to do, even though it's unethical behavior or arguably unethical behavior. Many times this occurs, what research will show is when you have a country, a community, organizations, people that are not or no longer embracing religion or spirituality, which is directly attached to moral behavior, what ends up happening, and I have students that conduct research in this area, what ends up happening is when you have lower levels of spirituality or religiosity, religious behaviors, views, values, what ends up happening is lower levels are correlated with higher levels of turnover, disruptive behavior in the workplace, people being late for work, bullying behaviors. However, and things like stress and burnout as well. If you do have higher levels of spirituality, and many organizations, top organizations, are turning to embracing religion in the workplace, meaning we're not promoting that anyone join a religion. However, if people within the organization are religious, they are allowed to practice their religious practices. Sorry. So in other words, if you have Muslim employees that need to pray periodically throughout the day. Many organizations are providing places for those workers to be able to wash up and then be able to worship and say their prayers. As a result, these individuals will experience, my research has shown they'll experience higher levels of well-being. Other research will show that they have lower levels of stress. My research shows that as well. And then lower levels of problematic behavior and higher levels of the positive behavior, giving, caring, being more honest, being more forgiving. So there's direct correlations between these two. And organizations that have a culture that embraces this will experience less corruption, more ethical behavior, more moral behavior. Now, here we're seemingly shifting to a totally different topic, but you will see that some of the things that we've been talking about can really help address limited resources. A reality is, globally, we are experiencing limited resources, some areas more than others. And some organizations have turned to, many organizations have turned to a concept that was developed by Toyota, and that is lean manufacturing. Now, I'm not going to go through the approach. I could have a whole 2-hour long presentation on what lean manufacturing is. But what I'll tell you that's important for now is that it is so important to have, first off, a leadership environment. If you want to have a lean manufacturing environment, if you want to have these characteristics associated with that apply to other areas like healthcare and distribution and education, law enforcement, all of these different areas, what that means is, first off, people have more of an ability to promote change, to identify problems as they occur. A culture is one of continuous improvement. In order to do this and have a culture like this, we need to have leaders. We just talked about that again. And as a result, when we have a lean environment, we're saving on the resources that we are using. Manufacturing is just a great example to describe. We're saving on those resources. We have less waste. And as a result, we are more profitable as an organization. And from an environmental standpoint, we're doing more good. Now, workers in a culture like this are going to be more engaged. So not only are they going to be helping with the challenge of limited resources, which may mean internally as well, limited resources. We don't have enough, we don't have the amount of revenue, for instance, to be able to hire as many people as we'd like to. That's limited resources. We don't have a large enough building to be able to expand and do the things that we want to do. That's a limited resource. However, if we have engaged employees that are serving not just as leaders, but also just are engaged in their jobs, then they are better able to identify challenges. They're more happy with their jobs. They're more trusting. Their management is more open to discuss challenges. And as a result, you start experiencing these benefits that can help address the limited resource challenge. Finally, retention is a major topic in the contemporary human resources and workplace. Retention of employees is critical because employees that stay within an organization longer are more than likely going to be more efficient, more productive, and efficiency equates to using less resources and conserving. Now let's talk about this concept I call, so this is not a industrial organizational concept per se, it's something I made up, but it is an important issue that's out there, and that's what I call unhealthy technology. If you look at this picture here, for instance, I think this is a good example. You might already know what I'm going to say here, but in this picture you see a lot of people that are not talking to each other. They're simply on their smartphones, and many people are even entering what's called cell phone addiction, where they can't put the phone aside, they can't even have normal, what you might refer to as normal, regular conversations, one-on-one conversations with individuals. And as a result, it can negatively impact interpersonal communication. And this may be something we don't know yet, it's perhaps too soon to tell, but younger generations may have, this may be a negative impact. I currently experience that for myself. I just don't know from a scientific standpoint if it's a real problem or not. And when I say real, meaning science would prove that this is a problem. But what I see with younger students, for instance, is they lack some of the interpersonal skills when dealing with their professor, for instance. And I can see it in emails are less professional. They look more like a quick text message. So there's some lost professionalism. There's perhaps even a little bit of a loss of respect because of social media and some of these things where there is little or no respect for people, for each other. Psychologically, when people grow up in this environment, they are not going to instantly be able to effectively communicate in the workplace. So this is why I refer to this concept of unhealthy technology. And we got to ask ourselves, so how do we manage this within the workplace when it does occur? And from an industrial organizational psychologist standpoint, perhaps just from a psychological standpoint, is we can develop training programs and things to address attitudes, communication skills. We can also have, I hate to say it, but even maybe policy where it either limits the use of certain technology so that way people are better interacting with each other. Let me give you one example. Many times, many of the greatest ideas within an organization are developed by people having lunch together, eating together. They're talking about what they're doing on the job and they exchange ideas. But if people are on their phones doing this and they're texting and things, that is stifled. So what ends up happening is innovation is stifled. Developing relationships among each other is stifled, and those relationships lead to greater trust, which of course leads to greater, as I mentioned, innovation, problem solving, performance, all of these challenges, even decreased levels of stress as people talk about their problems. Many of these things are not occurring because people are on their phones using technology versus talking to each other. This is a significant problem, I believe, that is a significant contemporary issue that perhaps is being not addressed as well as it currently should. I do not see that in the literature so much, but I believe it will be addressed more and more. And for those organizations that can address that right now, they'll be on the forefront and be able to better manage this challenge. This what I call a trust in technology is we got to remember that technology is created by humans, and the technology we create is only as good as what we program it to do, as what we put into it. And to some degree, if we over-trust the technology and not trust ourselves and our abilities, then we may be heading towards other types of challenges. So here again, the psychology of the problem is what I've been talking about, and that is people losing some of their skills in being able to communicate with each other. Finally, technology has also led to boring jobs. What do I mean by that? Well, boring jobs have always existed. In other words, just doing repetitive work. However, with the advent of technology, there are many more jobs to a large degree that may fit this category of being simply boring, monotonous. And as a result, if people are doing the same task all the way throughout the day with the same repetition, it can have physical problems that can occur. From my standpoint, I'm concerned perhaps even more so about the psychological problems. People are going to be getting easily bored with the job. If they have the opportunity, they're going to leave to find something better very quickly. They're not engaged in the workplace. They're not quite thinking about maybe if there's problems going on or whatever. So we need to develop a culture that perhaps values cross-training, helping each other learn different jobs and doing different things. So that way people are better engaged in their jobs. And even if they're doing lots of different boring jobs, at least they're getting different experiences and perhaps will stay within an organization longer. So this leads us to this challenge of turnover and talent retention. if you are in a workplace that has, let's say it's manufacturing actually technology, putting together cell phones, putting together various games and different things that are available, computer systems. If there are these types of boring jobs and things, well, we want to engage our employees because we want to reduce turnover. Turnover is a major problem because the costs associated with turnover are tremendous. Many organizations have no idea how much it costs their organization when they lose an employee. Depending on the organization, it can range from, in the low thousands of dollars to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. It can be extremely expensive. And the reason why is the direct costs associated with turnover. In other words, replacing an individual, advertisements, the interview process, the training process, all of those resources that are dedicated to getting someone trained to do the job of someone that just left. There are also lost resources, meaning the people that are leaving are a lost resource. They have knowledge, skills, abilities. They've been trained. You can consider them an asset of the organization that you have now lost. So you have to take a lesser asset that is a new employee and now develop them to be where that last asset was. So you're losing that resource. You're losing that asset when someone leaves an organization. Management many times is part of the challenge because management doesn't have those, like we mentioned earlier, many times those leadership abilities to help identify employees perhaps that are having some challenges and are maybe leaving. They also are not being proactive as much as they could to help engage employees, to keep them within the workplace. And that's where industrial organizational psychologists, I believe, really can provide information that many people are not aware of at how to motivate and engage employees. I'll talk about that here shortly. And of course, there's that lost production time. When you have new employees, they're not producing as much, and you have to sometimes have two new employees to make up for one experienced employee. Engaging employees, providing them with opportunities, it doesn't have to necessarily cost that much money to an organization, or if any at all, to keep employees engaged and therefore reduce levels of turnover and retain that talent. For instance, work-life balance. Many times organizations, we've seen this perhaps in instances of where you have a pandemic and people are working from home, and all of a sudden organizations are realizing a lot of the work can be done from home. Well, a few years ago, they perhaps did not believe the work could be done from home and were keeping employees at the workplace when they didn't have to be there, and therefore they were losing employees that just didn't want to work there anymore because their life at home was impacted negatively. If those people would have been if those organizations had been more creative to begin with, then they might have offered a better work-life balance. Well, thankfully, we're seeing some more of that right now, where more and more individuals are able to work from home, partially because they've been forced to do it, but now the companies are realizing the benefits. So not only, in this case, are you providing this work-life balance where people are spending more time with their families, but it can actually be much more inexpensive for an organization. They don't necessarily have to pay an employee as much because the employee is not commuting and spending all that money on commuting, for instance. The organization itself, it doesn't matter where they're located when they have virtual employees, so they don't have to pay some of the higher costs associated with having a building, for instance, in a major metropolitan area where maybe the costs of real estate are much more expensive. You also don't have to have as big of an office or big of a building, whether it be a distribution center, manufacturing facility, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be as big because you don't need as many offices, for instance, because people are working from home. They don't need that office. So there are many advantages to promoting a work-life balance that can also benefit the organization. Now let's talk about how people can be better motivated. I mentioned to you that industrial organizational psychologists, to a large degree, have significantly, perhaps more knowledge than many managers have regarding how to really motivate employees. What ends up many times occurring is that employees will work all year long, and then maybe if they're lucky, once a year, maybe they get a pay raise. They will get more money per hour, a higher salary, whatever it is. The reality is money has a very limited impact on how much it motivates people. What you see in front of you, and I oftentimes will use Maslow's needs theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I often use that to demonstrate some of these points I'm trying to make because it is a rather simple yet very effective tool for psychologists to use to help better understand some of the methods that are used, for instance, to motivate. So let's talk about that. So first off, the lower needs, physical security needs, those two are addressed strictly with money. The higher needs, social, ego, self-actualization, as you can see here in front of you, those are not addressed with money. So therefore, if organizations simply turn to paying someone more to try to keep them with the organization, they're perhaps wasting that money. They may not even need to give a raise. It may even be that if you give a raise, a pay raise, more money, that's insignificant, that may almost be more upsetting and insulting to a hard worker than if they never got anything at all. Now let's talk about this in more detail regarding how money and these other areas can impact people's performance. So first off, according to Maslow, once physical and security needs have been met, keep in mind these are directly met by money, then money will no longer motivate. Benefits, it doesn't necessarily matter as much. Even to some degree, this work-life balance we've been talking about, because once these needs are met, people want something more, different. Now, these are things that money will not take care of. As an example, in the middle here you see social, the need to being loved, belonging, inclusion. Those are not addressed with money. Those are addressed with such things as having events within an organization, recognizing people when they do a good job, having perhaps a sort of building a community within your organization, and even getting engaged in the community. As an example, some organizations have turned to charitable work, where employees are paid to have their time to spend maybe working with local charities and helping them out, maybe working with a local church or a school or whatever it may be. And what ends up happening is now the employees have more of a sense of belonging. They develop those relationships, and to a large degree, they don't have to be paid anymore. What I should actually say is not even much money from the organization has to be spent on these sort of things. So therefore, from my perspective, an organization can actually save money by coming up with more creative reward systems. I mentioned earlier that we need to look at people individually. This is where this also applies. The better a manager can understand the employees that works for them, the better they understand them, they will then in turn better understand to what degree they may need more money for their job because maybe they have a large family to take care of, or perhaps they don't care so much about the money. That employee maybe needs more social interaction. The more you know that and the more you can tailor your rewards for employees, the more efficient you will be, the more effective you will be with your money and your resources that you dedicate towards compensation and rewards. As people feel more included within the organization, now you have ego and self-actualization that will become important for individuals. So ego has to do more with self-esteem and the feeling of having some power over yourself, recognition, prestige. So therefore, similar to social where you want some recognition here, recognition has to do more with building up your ego. So not just recognition amongst your peers, but also recognition within the whole organization as a whole. And that recognition may come in the form of a new title, maybe a promotion, maybe some sort of what I would refer to as like elite benefits. In other words, if you achieve certain levels of activities and performance, and maybe you stay at an organization, let's say for 1, then 5 years, then 10 years, the longer you stay at an organization, perhaps you receive greater and greater benefits. And so as a result, something as simple as having maybe a separate room that you have access to. It's kind of like at an airport, where if you belong to a certain class, then you can go into this room and have the extra benefits. So if you stay at an organization longer, you have access to this room. It may sound kind of simplistic, perhaps even a little silly. However, the minimal cost it would take to create a reward like that can actually have a major impact on individuals, because they feel proud. They have a high level of pride with the organization, and they perhaps, if they're a year away from receiving that, they're going to stick around because they want to receive that award. Money does not do that. People can leave at any moment and find a place that will pay them more. But they are much less likely to leave an organization if they have all of this special recognition that they're not going to get at another organization. Finally, I'll emphasize again leadership development, education, engaging employees within the workplace, and allowing them to show their leadership abilities and be able to make decisions. These can not only help the organization become a better organization, but can help through continuous improvement, for instance, but can help keep those high-level top employees. Now, rapid change and innovation, we do live in an environment where things are changing very rapidly due to technology and all sorts of other things. We need to be able to innovate very quickly to be able to maintain our position in the marketplace. We need to innovate very rapidly in order to meet the demands of our customers. People are naturally resistant to change, and they may not be resistant in their personal lives. They may like different clothes, different music, different home, different food, whatever it might be. They don't mind changing that, but in the workplace, they're very resistant. How do you overcome that? You develop a culture that's more open, transparent. I again prefer the servant leadership culture, where people are less resistant to change because they're more trusting of leadership. They are more engaged with the change process. Things are more transparent. People are more honest. Everyone knows what the change is, why it's done. They contribute to the process. An industrial organizational psychologist can help create this type of culture. Training and development has to do with how leadership is developed, as well as cross-training individuals and making individuals familiar with how one area impacts another, which impacts another. And the more familiar employees are with the intricate relationship that the various departments have within an organization, the more likely they are to be able to contribute to that innovation process and be able to, once again, contend with the rapidly changing environment. I've been talking about leadership development, and we're reaching the end here. Leadership development is just so critical. I do promote the servant leadership model. I've created a model of my own that follows Greenleaf's approach. Greenleaf is the founder, they say, of servant leadership. The approach addresses all of the problems that we've been talking about. And if you develop a culture that's a servant leadership culture, what ends up occurring is these problems can be addressed in many different ways. Many organizations simply have a lack of understanding of the importance of having a leadership culture. This may be due to they think it's just kind of a low priority. They don't have the time to spend on something like this. They don't have the money to be able to afford training people to be better leaders or identifying them. Yet the reality is they are losing a lot of revenue. They're losing a lot of money as a result of not having leaders within an organization. You cannot measure the amount of innovative ideas and all of these other things that may be missing as a result of losing employees because you are not properly developing leaders. So in conclusion, I will not go through this list again, but we covered a lot of, many different contemporary challenges in the workplace. I do really encourage you, as you look at these more closely, really begin to keep an open mind at how an industrial organizational psychologist can not only address these challenges, so consider how they can address the challenges, but also consider where you may have thought something might be costly before, so that's why you don't do it. If you think very critically about the challenges associated with turnover and some of these other things, you may realize that what you did not want to do before, you may want to do now. The cost of developing leaders and hiring consultants to be able to develop a leadership culture can be minimal compared to what you will save or what you'll gain later. I do want to thank you again. My name is Dr. Dan Kahinka, and I do want to thank you for watching me today, and I just hope you have a wonderful and blessed day.